So, the first one I will read is The Wedding Night, which is a short piece that I wrote. Most of these are actually, these span a few years worth of writing, and more years than I care to remember, because I think that was about 2012. So, 10 years, the last decade or so of writing, I picked the ones I like the most at the moment. The Wedding Night was written as part of a wedding gift anthology that a group of writers, of which I was part, put together for one of our own who was getting married. Um, the anthology lasted longer than the wedding or than the marriage, but it was a pretty good set of stories anyway. This story involves Norse mythology, of which I know very little, but I did a bit of research, such as it was at the time. So, the wedding night. Torvald paused and thrust his head back through the doorway, addressing his new bride. She lay under the bedclothes, her chestnut hair, so recently relieved of the elaborate bridal crown she'd worn for most of the day, fanned across the pillows. He grinned. Now, I'll be right back. He trailed off. And I'll still be here when you do, she laughed. Now go, show them out and come back as quick as you can. We've business, you and I. She laughed again, and he felt a fluttering in his belly as his blood was torn between rushing to fill his face or his elsewhere. Gods, he loved this woman. He turned reluctantly to follow the six people, 3 men and 3 women, to the front door of his home. He and Asa had both been married before, so the removal of the bridal crown in the wedding bed was purely symbolic. But traditions were important. In the old days, they would have stayed longer, but these days, symbolic witnesses were good enough. He made his way to the sturdy front door where the men and women were waiting to take their leave. He shook their hands, gave his thanks, and endured their ribald comments and jests with good grace. He shouldered open the door, made of thick planking and daub, against a cutting winter wind, and ushered his guests out into the cold, admonishing them to be safe and tread carefully. Just as he was about to step back and allow the wind to push closed his door, a cloaked figure stepped into the doorway from out of the darkness beyond his lantern, and made as if to push past him into the house. Ho there! His left arm shot out, barring the stranger's way. I think you may have the wrong house, friend. He lowered the lantern somewhat to shed some light under the stranger's hood, and felt his legs go weak at the sight of the face within. Half of the face he saw was that of a youngish woman, with pale skin and even nondescript features. The other half of the face was a blackened, rotting ruin, the eye socket and part of the jaw showing through the tattered remains of the flesh. Hell, he whispered, his normally powerful voice deserting him. You have no business here. Not tonight. Fear not, Torval Sigmundson. Her face twisted briefly into a mask of bitterness and envy. I hold no domain over warriors such as yourself. You belong to Freya or Odin. I am not here for you. No, please, please, there must be some way. A bargain of some sort. And what sort of a bargain would you offer me? Could you offer me? It is her time, and I have need of a new body servant. It is not such a terrible fate, after all. Tears flowed, tears flowed freely down Torval's face, disappearing silently into the tangles of his beard. 20 years we waited, married to people we didn't love, wanting only each other. Now you would take that away before we can enjoy it? His voice began to firm as determination and more than a little anger began to replace fear. I can think of no fate more terrible, more cruel than that. What then do you offer? A son, he said. Asa has always wanted a son. Wait for our son and grant me 5 years after, that he may know his father, and you may have me in my wife's place. As I said, I have a need of a new body servant. Why would I take you instead? As you said, warriors go to Odin or Freya. How many warriors does Helheim see? And how many of your servants come to you willingly and living? Do as I ask, and I will be your willing living servant for so long as you desire. She hesitated, but he could already see his victory in her face. His heart, his heart both exulted and despaired. You have your deal. It is done. As he re-entered the bedchamber, his beautiful new wife looked up at him. What took you so long, Torval? I began to think you'd found something more interesting than me. No, my love. Nothing could be more interesting or more important to me than you. A bit sappy, but I enjoyed working in the Norse mythology there.
Hmm.
The the second one is called Larry, spelled with two L's. This is important. Very short. This was 150 words. I used to take part in a flash fiction challenge that required exactly 150 words. Larry squinted into the unforgiving glare of the afternoon sun. Sweat tickled his sides as his quarry approached. So naive, so unwitting, so delicious. That's right, he muttered. Come to Papa. He surveyed his surrounding area. Nothing could interfere with this plan. This time he'd not have victory snatched away at the last second. Nobody around. Even that old goat from next door had retreated indoors from the heat. Ha! His loss. He cringed at a squeal of delight. His prey had spotted him. He recovered quickly, though, attempting to hide his hatred of all things not himself. Prey approached, a sticky hand outstretched to besmirch his fine fleece. His head darted out, snake-like, to the other hand, the one holding the ice cream cone. The little girl's bereaved wails of loss were the perfect counterpoint to the melting of the frozen goodness on his tongue. He smiled. Larry is a llama, in case that wasn't clear. Hence the two L's. The third one is called Moth Night. This was a very, I don't know if it's flash or yeah, it's a flash fiction piece, but it basically serves as a prologue for a novel that I'm currently working on. So I took the world and the main character, well, a character in the story, and uh, I'm trying to build that out into a novel at the moment. So we'll see how that goes over the next few months. But it's called Moth Night. A breeze wandered aimlessly through vacant streets, carrying with it the chill of approaching winter, and the moon, blocked now and again by passing clouds, created more shadows than it dispelled. Staccato footsteps echoed from the stone walls and iron grillwork of commercial district storefronts, where those with money shopped by day and those without it slept by night. Most nights. A young woman turned the corner, shoulders hunched against the cold air, and one hand holding her too thin coat closed in the front. As she passed each doorway, she peered intently at the signs above them, muttering under her breath. No, miss, they said. Not tonight, not outside the inner wall. Tonight's a moth night. Ha! Moth night. Who ever heard of a coachman who wouldn't take a fare? And because of moths, of all things? Ridiculous. A sharp gust of wind from the mouth of a narrow alley almost dislodged her hat as she passed, startling her from her angry reverie. She paused to settle the offending accessory more firmly in place and check the street numbers in case she'd somehow accidentally passed her destination. Still 2 or 3 more blocks to go, she saw. Very well. She set off again, squinting against the breeze that had now picked up somewhat. She had taken only a few steps when she was brought up short again by the sight of a silhouette standing under a flickering gaslight a block ahead. Glancing around, she realized that this mysterious figure was the only other person she'd seen in some time. She debated whether to continue the way she'd been going or to detour a block or two out of the way to avoid the stranger, but decided that she was worrying over nothing. She was just about to continue walking when the person up ahead began to thicken. After a moment, she realized that what she had taken for a tall man with a tightly furled cloak was in actuality something with a tightly furled pair of seemed to be wings. Wings which were now being extended to either side of the Moth Night, she breathed. Shit. Detouring suddenly seemed like the much better option. As she turned to make her way back to the previous intersection, the wind reversed, bringing her the thing's scent, earthy and musky and damp. The smell was so strong that she felt momentarily dizzy. She shook her head to clear it, and as she did so, she noticed the wall of the building next to her. It was blooming. From out of the bricks, tiny blossoms were sprouting. Each one was no bigger than the head of a pin. There were hundreds of them, thousands of them. They spread to cover the entire building, in every color she had ever seen. She leaned in, breathing deeply of the heady, musky fragrance. How strange! From this close, she could see that each blossom was made up of hundreds of tinier blossoms. She wondered if the tinier blossoms was made of tinier blossoms still. She giggled. The wind shifted. Uh, the wind shifted, swinging around to blow again in its original direction, and the flowers on the wall fell away, tumbling up the street where she quickly lost sight of them in the gloom. She stifled a startled scream as she noticed that the dark figure, which had been standing more than a block up the street, was now no more than 20 yards away. The moon came out from behind the clouds, and she screamed in earnest as she got an unimpeded view of the thing. It was mostly wings, this thing the locals called a moth. Its wings were about as wide across as they were tall, and it was a foot or two taller than the tallest man she'd ever seen. They were also wings that were never meant for flight. They were lumpy, fleshy things, grotesquely swollen in places and thin enough in others to allow the scant moonlight to shine faintly through. Their edges were in tatters, fluttering in the wind like macabre bunting. They glistened wetly. The moth's body, or at least that part of it where the wings met, was a mass of writhing was the word that sprang into her mind. Writhing, wriggling tentacles. They cast about blindly, as if seeking something that they couldn't quite sense, roiling around as if each was independent of the others and was possessed of a mind of its own. Several of the larger members ended in hard, sharp-looking pincers or beaks, which snapped randomly open and shut. She gagged and stumbled backwards a few steps before regaining control of her limbs. Turning, she began to run back the way she'd come. Damn it! A second one was now standing at the corner she'd turned moments before. Its wings were still furled, but it was starting to stir. Panicking now, she cast about for somewhere to run. 3 steps further, the mouth of the narrow alleyway beckoned. The darkness was complete. She made her way slowly down the alleyway, blindly feeling along both walls with outstretched fingers, in spite of the noisome things she felt. She was looking for a door or window of some sort, some way of getting walls between herself and those things. There were no doors or windows, though, at least not at ground level, and now she found herself fetched up against a third wall at the back of the alley. She had no idea how high this wall was, other than that it was higher than she could jump. It might well be another building for all she knew. She whirled to face the opening of the alley as she heard the rustle of trash and litter being disturbed. Maybe it was just rats. Maybe. She pressed her back against the unyielding stone of the alley's end and waited for a repetition of the noise, but she could hear nothing over the frantic thudding of her heart and her panicked breathing. Then she caught a taste of that familiar musky smell in the air. Not just rats, then. She giggled for a second time as she felt the pull of hysteria rising to engulf her. Just as a third giggle was bubbling up and about to escape her lips, she felt the wall behind her give way, spilling her to the ground. Ground, she was startled to find, that was smooth and cold rather than rough and filthy. In contrast with the darkness of the alley, the place where she found herself was quite well lit. Looking around as she rose to her knees, she saw that she was in the middle of a lavish ballroom. The wall must have hidden a secret doorway to some sort of ballroom for the nobility. The nobility were infamous for their secret passages and doorways, after all. The music, which presumably had ceased when she had suddenly tumbled in, began again, and the many finely dressed people once more took up their dancing and their conversations, as if her presence, kneeling in the middle of their dance floor, was in no way unusual. As she started to rise, a man stepped up and offered her his hand. He was tall, with a strong jaw and a thick shock of coal-black hair. His features, which seemed regular enough, were obscured by a cream-colored domino mask. He was dressed in a rich black velvet, which was accented by a black top hat and black cape. The cape was lined a bright crimson, which matched exactly his satin cravat. It was his eyes, though, that caught her breath and set her heart racing. She'd read in storybooks about silly young girls getting lost in a man's eyes. Never having been a particularly silly young girl, she had never considered that this might actually be possible to do. Now she knew that it was. He smiled slightly as he assisted her to her feet, but then kept her hand once she was standing. The, mu- the musician started up with one of the new 3-beat dance pieces she'd heard about. Waltzes, they were called, and her mystery prince inclined his head as if to ask if she'd care to dance. She would care very much to dance as it happened. He slid his other arm around to support the small of her back, and they three-stepped their way out between the other couples. She was starting to feel as if she was floating, her feet not even touching the ground, when a tremendous shattering pain pierced first her belly, then her chest. The ballroom disappeared in an instant, and she found herself once again in total darkness, her arms pinned to her sides as if wrapped in a damp, musty carpet. She opened her mouth to scream, and before she could even draw breath, something thick and ropey forced its way into her mouth and down her throat. The world became fire. Forensic divination has tentatively ID'd the body as Sylvia Parthas. She was apparently in town to visit a cousin, but never made it. The cousin says he was expecting her, but not until Friday. He's talking to the detectives over there. Was it a moth, sir? I've never seen. What a horrible. Thank you, Constable. That'll be all. Inspector Franklin waved a dismissal at the young man and crouched down to get a better look at the body. Two large puncture wounds in the torso, countless smaller ones all over the skin where the creature had gripped its prey, and not a drop of fluid left in the body. He closed his eyes against the wave of anger that washed through him. Something needed to change. This was the seventh victim in 2 weeks. Most of them had been homeless, and a few had been from out of town. None of them had been wealthy, but since when did that make their lives less valuable? One's turning into a. The novel is going to be uh, I think it's called Gaslight, sort of like a faux Victorian fantasy setting detective novel with magic and monsters. So,
That was what I picked up, so good job.
thanks. The last one, much shorter than the previous one, by the way, is my entry. I run a flash fiction. I just started running a flash fiction, um, not really challenge, but a flash fiction thing on my own Discord server. And this was the first prompt, and this is my response to it. The prompt is on the PDF for anyone that wants to take a look at it. It shows, for those not looking at it, it shows a barren sort of football or soccer field with a goal in the center of the picture. Looks foggy and washed out, and the text on the picture says, "Betrayals change the way you perceive moments." It turns out that InspiroBot is actually really good at generating flash fiction prompts. Who knew? So this story is called The Junkie. He hated waiting. He'd never managed the knack of just being still and passing time. The urge to be doing, to be moving, to be active was too strong in him. Always had been. Places like this, situations like this, didn't leave him with much choice, though. The lack of stimulation just made it worse. He glanced around again, hoping for something new upon which he could fix his attention. Fat chance. He was stood in the middle of an empty field covered in patchy brown grass that, if he was honest, probably hadn't seen many better days. There was a soccer goal, just the one. Miraculously, it still had the netting in it, a vandalistic oversight that added to his feeling of surreality. The weather was cold and it was damp, and fog made the whole place feel small and isolated, as if this little piece of reality had been somehow disconnected from everything else the moment he'd set foot on it. It reminded him of another place, the place between places where he'd been changed. Or maybe changed wasn't the right word. The thing he'd become had always been in there inside of him, if he was honest. Where he'd been distilled, maybe. Well, whatever. This place reminded him of that place, and he didn't like it. It gave him the creeps. He had hope, though. Hope that everything could change, would change. He had a line on something that could put him back to the way he'd been before. It was a small, feeble thing, this hope of his, but he thought himself to be no longer capable of. Yeah, but he thought himself to be no longer capable of the emotion at all, so he cherished this tiny spark of something positive and did everything he could to keep it alive. You came. I have to say I'm surprised, expecting you to be a no-show. The voice came from just behind and to the left of him. He hadn't felt the man approaching, something which should have been impossible. He turned to face the speaker and immediately understood. The man looked human, but he felt hollow. Where the personality and emotion and, well, for want of a better word, soul should be, there was only emptiness. It was like looking into a mirror. You're like me. I should have known. Like you? The man smiled. I suppose I am, more or less. He trailed off, and they both stood there, letting the silence build. Finally, the man spoke again. A little birdie told me you wanted to see me, that you need something I may have. He felt his hopeful little flame flare up, and had the impression that the man leaned in towards him, though neither of them had moved. I want out. I want to undo what's been done to me. I was told that you could make that happen. The man began to laugh. There was no humor in the sound. Out, is it? Undo? I'll give anything. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and the man turned to face him. Anything? My little friend, you have nothing left to give. You gave everything you were to become what you are. There is nothing else. There is no undoing. There is no way out. There is only this. Forever. There must be. There is not, and you have only yourself to blame. You got here the same way we all did, chasing the ultimate high. And now you have it. And it isn't enough, and you want to stop, but you can't, and it never ends. You can't even die now. You can only drift through eternity, feeding off the pain and suffering of others, needing more and more of it just to get by. There is no way out. He felt a shifting in the man as if a curtain had parted in the hollowness, and suddenly he could sense the man's internal state, the same way he could with the humans he fed from. He saw the truth of the man's words in the absoluteness of his despair. The flame of his hope died, overwhelmed and extinguished by anguish and a wave of his own despair. The man shuddered, and the curtain closed once again, but not before he sensed the oddly familiar psychic connection between them. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the man and into the fog. The son of a bitch was feeding on his suffering. The man had led him along and fed his hope for the sole purpose of destroying it and reaping the resultant emotional pain. As hurt as he couldn't help but think about how potent the pain of someone else like himself would be. So much more concentrated and powerful than the average person. He could feel the always present pull of his cravings and began to consider his options. And that, my friends, are my 4 stories. Thanks for bearing with